Okay, so get this right. Ready for this? Hundreds of unexploded bombs from World War II, just sitting there on the seabed off the coast of Norfolk. And guess what? They're planning to build wind farms right on top of them.
Yeah. Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
That's what I thought. So we found this BBC article and it lays it all out. Really interesting read. It talks about this energy giant, RWE, and they're trying to navigate this minefield, literally.
So they're facing what? Delays, safety risks, and obviously what about the impact on the local communities and the marine life?
Yeah, exactly. All of that.
Yeah, that's not trivial. So to start, let's talk about the scale of this problem. RWE's initial survey. Well, they found over 600 unexploded objects in a 40-kilometer stretch of seabed. And here's the thing, that number is almost certainly going to go up as they continue their investigation.
Wow.
So we could be talking about thousands of these things just lurking beneath the waves.
That's a lot of bombs. It's been over 80 years since World War II ended. Why are there so many unexploded bombs still down there?
Well, you have to think about it. The North Sea was a major battleground during the war. I mean, naval battles, aerial bombardments, all sorts of ordnances being thrown around. It's not surprising that some of them didn't detonate and just sank to the bottom.
Right.
And here's the other thing. Salt water, it's corrosive, but it's also a great preserver. So these bombs are just sitting there, waiting to be disturbed.
So, I mean, what can they even do about it? You can't just ignore hundreds of unexploded bombs, can you?
No, not really. The article mentions three main options that RWE is considering. The first is detonation. Seems like the most straightforward approach, right? Just blow them up in a controlled environment. But even that comes with risks.
Yeah, for sure. What are the other options?
Well, they could try rerouting the cables, for the wind farms, around the bombs. That way they wouldn't have to touch them. But it could make the project a lot more complex, a lot more expensive.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then there's relocation, which would only be feasible for a small number of devices that are deemed safe to move.
Gotcha. So each option has its own set of challenges. It doesn't seem like there's an easy fix here.
No, not at all. And to make matters even more complicated, we have to consider the environmental impact. This area of the North Sea, well, it's home to something called a Sabellaria reef, and it's a really important habitat for marine life.
Hold on. What is a Sabellaria reef?
It's a type of biogenic reef, which means it's created by living organisms. These tiny little worms, they're called Sabellaria alveolata, and they build tubes out of sand and shell fragments. And these tubes, well, they form a complex three-dimensional structure, providing shelter and food for tons of other species.
So it's kind of like an underwater apartment complex for sea creatures?
Pretty much, yeah. And these reefs are super important for maintaining biodiversity and the health of the ecosystem. But they're also very fragile.
Right.
The shock waves from detonating bombs nearby could damage the reef structure and disrupt the whole balance of the ecosystem.
So it's not just about human safety then. These bombs could have a ripple effect on the whole marine environment.
That's right. And that's where things get really tricky. You have to weigh the benefits of renewable energy, which is crucial for combating climate change, obviously, against the potential harm to the environment and the risks to human safety.
It's like a real-life moral dilemma playing out on the seabed. But before we get into that, let's talk about those two specific incidents, the ones mentioned in the article.
Yeah.
Because they really drive home the danger that these bombs still pose. You've got that unplanned detonation during a bridge construction project in Great Yarmouth.
Right. And then there's the fishing boat incident near Cromer. The crew was injured after their equipment snagged on an unexploded bomb.
Yeah.
These incidents really show us that these bombs are not just historical relics, they're active hazards. It can have a real impact on people's lives.
It's crazy that something that happened 80 years ago could still cause so much disruption today. Which leads us to this question. How does all this affect the people who live in Norfolk?
That's a great question, and it's something we'll definitely want to unpack further. The article talks about the anxiety and uncertainty that these unexploded bombs create for the local communities.
Yeah. I can only imagine what it's like to live with that knowledge, that there are hundreds of potential bombs just ticking away beneath the waves. Off your coast.
Yeah, it's like a constant low-level sense of dread. And if they do decide to detonate the bombs, well, there's the potential for disruption to fishing activities, possible evacuations, and the general feeling of unease that comes with knowing that there are explosions happening near your home.
Right. It's not just the immediate danger, it's the psychological impact as well. These communities have been living with the legacy of World War II for generations, and now they're facing this new threat. stemming directly from that conflict. It's a lot to handle.
Yeah, absolutely. It raises some important questions about the long-term consequences of war and how we deal with what's left behind, even decades later. But maybe we save that discussion for a little later, right now. Let's dig deeper into those potential solutions and the technical challenges involved. Okay, so let's break down those three options for RWE. Detonation, rerouting, and relocation. At first, you might think detonation is the simplest one, but it's not exactly like setting off fireworks underwater.
Really? Tell me more.
Well, you have to consider the size of these things and the type of ordnance. It's not just little bombs. Some of these could be huge, like massive naval mines or depth charges. And detonating something that big underwater, it creates this massive pressure wave that can travel for miles, causing all sorts of damage to marine life, even to coastal structures.
So it's not just the Sabellaria Reef we need to worry about then?
No, not at all. There's also the possibility of releasing hazardous materials into the water. You see, a lot of these World War II bombs, they contain chemicals and heavy metals, and those can really contaminate the ecosystem.
Right.
And then there's the noise pollution. Underwater detonations are incredibly loud. They can disrupt marine mammal communication and their behavior patterns.
Wow. Okay, so detonation is a lot more complicated than it sounds. What about rerouting the cables? Is that a better option?
Well, it's definitely worth looking into, especially if it means less environmental impact. But it also has its challenges. For one, rerouting those cables, it can make the wind farm project much longer and much more expensive.
Makes sense.
Plus, you need to really understand the seabed. You need to know exactly where those unexploded bombs are.
Oh, yeah.
You need incredibly precise maps, really detailed surveys, just to find the safest route for the cables. And even then, there's always that risk of running into something unexpected.
So it's kind of a gamble either way. What about relocating the bombs? Is that even possible?
It's definitely the toughest option. It's really only possible for bombs that are considered safe to move. And even then, moving these big unexploded bombs, it's super delicate. You need special equipment, highly trained people, lots and lots of safety precautions.
Sounds like a logistical nightmare. I bet it's also the most expensive option.
You're right. Relocation's usually the costliest approach. It's usually a last resort.
So we've got these three options, each with its own risks and challenges. What do you think RWE will do?
Well, they're still figuring things out. It's hard to say for sure right now, but my guess is they'll probably end up doing a mix of all three. Maybe relocate a few of the riskiest devices, reroute some of the cables, and then use controlled detonations for the rest.
That sounds like a balanced approach, trying to take everything into account. But it still leaves us with that question about the people in Norfolk. We talked about their anxieties earlier, but do they have any options? Do they have any say in this whole thing?
That's a really important point, and it's often overlooked in these big infrastructure projects. I think transparency and community engagement are key here. RWE really needs to communicate clearly with the local community about the risks and the benefits of each option and let them have a voice in the decision-making process.
So it's not just a technical issue, it's a social and political one too.
Exactly. You can't just force these kinds of projects on people
Mm-hmm.
without listening to their concerns. It's about building trust and finding solutions that work for everyone.
I agree. But let's face it, you're never going to please everybody. Some people are going to be totally against any kind of detonation.
You're absolutely right. That's why it's crucial to have open and honest conversations, address people's fears, explain things clearly, and try to reduce the risks as much as possible. It's not about finding the perfect solution, because let's be honest, there probably isn't one. It's about finding the best possible outcome, given the situation.
I see your point, and this isn't just happening in Norfolk, is it? I mean, there must be unexploded bombs in other coastal areas around the world.
You're right. This is a global issue. It's part of the legacy of past conflicts, and it's still a challenge today as we keep pushing for renewable energy, especially offshore. We're going to keep running into these problems.
It's like a ticking time bomb waiting to happen, literally. And it really makes you think about how we balance our need for clean energy with the legacy of these past conflicts.
For sure. It makes us confront the reality that progress often comes with a price. And in this case, that price might be the disruption of marine ecosystems, the risk to human safety, and the possibility of reawakening the traumas of the past.
So what's the takeaway here? Is this a story about the dangers of renewable energy, or is there something more to it?
I think it's more about the complexities of progress, about unintended consequences, and the importance of thinking long-term when making decisions that affect the environment and human well-being.
I see. It's a reminder that the past never really goes away. It shapes our present in ways we don't always realize. And as we work toward a more sustainable future, we have to face these legacies, both literally and figuratively.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the true cost of progress and how we measure it. Is it all about economic growth, technological advancement, or should we be thinking about these long-term impacts on the environment and society?
It's like we solve one problem and another one pops up. In this case, literally from the ocean.
Right. We can't just focus on the immediate benefits. We have to think about the whole picture, the long-term consequences, and how they affect different communities and different ecosystems.
So, where do we even begin with such a complex problem?
Well, we definitely can't ignore it. These bombs aren't going to disappear on their own. And as we shift to renewable energy, we'll likely face similar challenges in other parts of the world.
Okay, so what can we actually do about it?
First, we need data. We need to know where these bombs are, what types they are, and how dangerous they are. That means surveying and mapping the seabed, which is expensive and time-consuming, but it's absolutely crucial.
So, data is important.
Yeah.
What else?
We also need better technology. Can we find safer ways to detonate these bombs? More environmentally friendly ways? What about robots? Can they move these bombs without risking human lives?
That sounds promising,
It does.
but I imagine that takes time.
It does. But I think it's worth it. If we're serious about renewable energy, we have to be ready for these challenges. And remember, these challenges aren't just technical. They're social and ethical.
You mentioned the ethical side a couple of times.
Right. Well, think about the communities near these wind farm projects. They're the ones taking on the risk. They might have to leave their homes. If there's a detonation, their fishing areas might be closed off.
We can't just ignore their concerns.
Exactly. We need to talk to them, listen to them, and involve them in the decision-making. Find solutions that work for everyone.
So we need data, we need better technology,
Okay.
and we need to involve the community.
Yes, exactly. A multifaceted approach.
I like that.
And, this situation can teach us a lot. It forces us to think critically about the trade-offs of renewable energy and to approach these projects with responsibility, with awareness.
It's like these bombs are reminding us that progress isn't always easy.
Right.
It can be messy and complicated,
Exactly.
full of surprises.
Progress isn't about being perfect. It's about learning, adapting, and finding better solutions.
Well said. So we've covered a lot today. We started with a story about wind farms and bombs and ended up talking about progress and conflict and what it means to make responsible decisions.
It all started with that BBC article. Shows how even simple news stories can lead to deeper conversations.
Absolutely. But before we go, I want to leave you with one last thought. As we tackle climate change and move to cleaner energy, how do we make sure our actions today don't create problems for tomorrow?
That's a big question. It's about thinking long-term and making sure our sustainable future doesn't harm future generations.
Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those tough questions.